Good evening and welcome to what is going to become the first of many videos, I guess, for me. I think every brand ambassador in the country is probably in exactly the same situation, thinking, what on earth am I supposed to do with my time now? How am I supposed to get out there and reach the people that I usually talk to? So whilst I wish I could come and see you all in your bars and your restaurants and your places of work, unfortunately now I'm going to become that guy who is always posting on social media. Now, I'm working on a kind of a structure or a way we can do this in a more kind of formal way, but for now I thought it might just be quite interesting to chat a little bit about stuff that's been on my mind, what I've been doing today, and how we can apply that to what we do when we make drinks in bars. And today, something that I've been thinking about a lot in preparation for what we're doing with the overall dojo program that I'm sure you've all heard a bit about and seen what looks like the same video, but is in fact 5 different videos with different content. But ultimately we're doing this big module on umami and seasoning in cocktails. I just wanted to talk a little bit about that today, effectively. Now, I'm sure most of you will be aware of the concept of having 5 basic tastes, and there's something that I often talk about with the staff that I've worked with in the past when I've been managing my own bars, and that is, what exactly is flavour? And for me, I'm not sure, of course, to the extent to which flavour scientists might agree with me, but my understanding from the research and the reading that I've done is that flavour, effectively, is what happens when you bring together taste and aroma. So you have, obviously, this amazing ability, this ability to take senses from all different parts of your body, and your nose actually is one of the places that we get some of the most amazing experiences from in the form of aroma. Now, what actually happens then is that as we taste things, we get one set of information, and as we then sense the aromas of what we're eating, effectively, those other senses are added to the senses we perceive through the sense of taste. So, interestingly, flavour is effectively taste plus aroma. And today, I guess one of the things I want to talk about is one of those most unusual and interesting of tastes, umami. So today I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail in terms of the science or history or even lots of recipes that you can do with umami, but more give a broad understanding, or at least my understanding, based on the research and my experience that I've done, to basically understand how I think about it and how maybe you can apply these to the ways that you make drinks, whether you work in a bar or if you just make them at home. So what is umami? Now, there are 5 basic tastes, and I think most people are aware of these. So obviously you have sweet, you have salty, you have bitter, you have sour, and lastly this more recently discovered taste of umami. And what's interesting is actually it looks as though there may well be more than these 5 tastes. I've heard lots of things about whether the concept of something being metallic is a taste, or is there anything that actually lets us know there's fat and oil in food, like maybe actually we do have a way of tasting the presence of fat and oil. But so far, as an international community, we've basically decided for now that there are definitely 5 key tastes that we can get on our palate. And what's really interesting is that 2 of those tastes are very obviously flavour enhancers, and 2 of them are more useful for providing perhaps contrast when you're creating a dish or a drink. So let's be honest, I'm sure you can guess what they are, but sweetness and salt both enhance and lift and boost other flavours that you might find in whatever you're creating. On the other hand, citrus or acidity and bitterness, these tend to provide a counterbalance to everything else that's either on our plate or in our glass. So when you have a drink with some really fantastic tart lemon juice, that's going to provide a real sense of brightness and a contrast to perhaps the other flavours that you might be finding in your cocktail. In the same way, if we use something like an incredibly bitter herb when we're creating a dish, if that dish is otherwise really rich or really oily or perhaps too salty, that bitterness will just bring the dish together and create a sense of balance across the plate. And umami is that final last, what is that? Like, where is it? How do I know what it is? And I think everyone gets taught the same thing, which is that generally speaking, think about tomatoes, think about mushrooms. These are the sorts of ingredients that have a huge amount of this umami flavour, this taste. What is it, right? And I guess it's interesting to understand a little bit about the history. So it was discovered in Japan, somewhat unsurprisingly, given that I'm talking about it on the Suntory brand ambassador page. But it was discovered by a chap who basically noticed that a lot of Japanese food had this elusive, amazing deliciousness to it, as he put it. And actually that's where the name comes from. So he did a load of research to understand in dashi and ramen and other sorts of foods from East Asia, what is that thing that makes it so special? And he discovered this thing that he called umami, this taste. And broadly speaking, we know a lot about it. It's something to do with amino acids and glutamates coming together, and I'm not going to go into that today. But MSG, you've all heard of that, and that is effectively a kind of very precise version of umami that you can just add to any old dish. And it's got a really bad rep, and same as anything, you shouldn't use it in great quantities, but it's not in itself necessarily unhealthy. Think of it kind of like you'd think of salt, effectively, yeah? And the word that he used was ume. Well, umai, if I say it a little bit more correctly. My Japanese, sadly, is not as good as I wish it was, and probably should be. But that means delicious in Japanese, right? So umami is the sense of deliciousness that you find in things. And that is obviously seems a bit ridiculous, right? Because if you balance the other four basic flavors right, then surely that makes something delicious, and therefore everything tasty is umami. And really, I think it meant deliciousness in his context, right? In the sense of what he found delicious in food and in drinks. And I think really the best way to understand it is that savoury feeling that we get. That feeling kind of at the back of your palate here that just brings things together and provides a roundness, a softness, and a sense of indulgence as you eat it. And if you do think of fantastic mushroom soups or chicken stocks or dashi or soy sauces, these are the sorts of ingredients that have fantastic umami content. It's really interesting actually when it comes to talking to chefs, and particularly when it comes to talking to bartenders about how they use umami in their cocktails. I actually was really lucky to do one of the more well-known, more well-regarded cocktail competitions a few years ago, and one of the years that I did that competition, I was in the final, and there was a challenge around umami, and I actually remember very little about what I did and my drinks and everything else around it, and I'm sure they weren't great, I'm sure they weren't perfect by any means. What I do remember is that I borrowed some glassware from the Gibsons, so shout out to the Gibson, thank you for letting me use some really lovely glassware in the shape of a sea urchin. It's really cool. But in that competition, my lasting memory, well actually I've got two lasting memories. The first and most important though is that frankly most of the drinks just weren't very nice. Because the challenge was about umami, the brief I remember was, you know, use umami in its best possible form. And my feeling was that when I did the research, umami wasn't something that was ever supposed to be the main flavour of any finished dish or drink. And what we saw was that everyone made these drinks with tons of tomato and tons of mushroom and tons of soy sauce, and they just tasted unpleasant. Because rather than trying to create a balanced cocktail, there'd been such a focus on creating an umami cocktail. I think all of us as chefs and bartenders have a tendency sometimes to focus too much on just creating something cool and something that fits a particular brief and is a little bit different and on trend and exciting and can impress everybody from their friends to consumers, but ultimately maybe just isn't as delicious as if they'd created a truly well-balanced cocktail. And I think if you understand umami well, you can add a whole other layer to your balancing of drinks. You can add a whole other layer of complexity that actually will bring your drinks together and create something even more balanced than would have been possible if you hadn't used anything with umami flavor. Now, in the interests of talking about things that I'm actually doing on a day-to-day basis and what I'm finding interesting, I wanted to introduce you guys to one of my favourite products. I think one of my favourite things that I've discovered for use in cocktails over the last 2 or 3 years, and that is this stuff. So this is a ponzu. Okay, this specifically is a tomato ponzu, but I'll come and talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But to explain briefly what ponzu itself as a category of sauce or condiment or seasoning is, ponzu is, I always first described it as being like an acidified soy sauce, or an acidic or a citrusy soy sauce. So basically what they do is they start off by making a dashi. So a dashi is a sort of broth that is very common. It's the base of ramen, it's the base of many sauces that you find in Japanese and Asian cooking. Generally speaking, for making ponzu, what you'd do is you'd start off with some seaweed, some katsuboshi, which is like kind of fermented dried tuna flakes, some mirin, some rice vinegar, and you brew that down to make a really lovely dashi broth, potentially adding any other flavourings you might want to that broth. And you take it off, strain it, cool it, and then acidify it using citrus fruits, right? So I'm sure you all know of your top Japanese citrus fruits, whether it's yuzu or sudachi or mandarin or anything else like that, right? You can literally use anything you want. And that just provides that rich acidity, that vibrant, kind of powerful contrast to other things. And ponzu generally is used either as a kind of a marinade or often as a dip that you might have for sashimi or sushi, and lots of other forms of use in cooking. But that's broadly speaking what a ponzu is, and it's really nice for adding that complex umami to cocktails. You know, you get lots of different flavors out there, and whether you're making something that's obviously umami, like perhaps a Bloody Mary or a red snapper, or something that wouldn't usually have umami, if you balance it in just right, it'll just serve to soften the edges, round off a cocktail and boost everything else in there, because much like sweetness and salinity, umami is a lifting or enhancing taste profile. So this particular ponzu is a tomato ponzu, which I got online from a website called sushi.com. I have a small lisp, not always noticed, but it is there, and it makes it very tricky to do videos for social media. But effectively, what we've got here is something where they're creating a tomato vinegar, in a nutshell, right? And they're doing this in an interesting place called Ehime, which is an island. It's the second smallest island in Japan. And what we do then is we take that and we add it to perhaps the more traditional base of a ponzu, right? So all those ingredients that I mentioned a moment ago. And what's really interesting here is the Ehime prefecture in the Shikoku Island, rather. I made a slight mistake earlier. That's a prefecture that's really well known for making citrus fruits. Yeah. So unsurprisingly, in the Ehime prefecture, there's a lot of ponzu being made, and actually regarded as probably one of the best regions in the whole of Japan for finding fantastic ponzu products. So what we've got here then is something that's going to provide flavours that perhaps people are quite familiar with here in the UK, but also adding that layer of umami to your cocktails. It's a really nice kind of stepping stone for you and your guests into the world of umami seasonings. And a little fun fact with this one, if anyone asks you, so why tomato? Why, this is a Japanese product, well, why are you using tomato? That's such a Mediterranean ingredient. And the answer is that actually French and Italian cuisine in Japan is one of the most popular things out there. They love French and Italian food. I think actually, please don't tell my Italian friends, although I'm sure given that 50% of the bartending industry is made up by the beautiful hospitality of Italians, I'm probably going to get found out. But the point is here that they've decided to kind of bring together that more modern understanding in Japan of what flavours they love, and the idea of umami flavours from the European countries, and applying it to the traditional products of the Ehime prefecture. And if you look up here, what I'm doing, so if you look up here at the kanji, this first symbol reflects the kind of the sound to. This reflects the sound ma, and you see the same symbol again, to. So that quite literally reads as tomato, simply. Nice and fun. As soon as it's coming towards the end of my day, I thought I would take that tomato ponzu that we just talked about and show a little bit about how I understand you can make a better cocktail and utilize umami in a more exciting and more appropriate way. So when I've been reading about how we use ponzu correctly, the best thing I've learned over the last 4 or 5 years of using umami in cocktails is really you shouldn't use it as the main thing. I alluded to this before. This should be something that is there in the background. You can't immediately put your finger on what it is. I talk in my seminars a lot about yugen, and I'll talk about this in another episode of these kind of live streams, I suppose. But for today, what I'm going to encourage you to do is to use these sorts of seasonings in a slightly smaller amount than perhaps you might traditionally think about it, and just find that creating that softness, that roundness in your drink that I talked about before. And we're going to use, of course, the inimitable House of Suntory trilogy. I've got with me, of course, Haku vodka, Roku gin, and Toki blended Japanese whiskey. And because, you all know me fairly well, I've prepared myself a silly joke, which is to use my favourite thing in the world, whiskey. So, what we're doing is we're creating a twist on a Boulevardier. A Boulevardier, for those of you that don't know, is effectively like a Negroni cocktail, an Italian aperitif-style drink, but made with whiskey. Now, I'm not using bourbon, I'm using Tocchi. I'm then going to be having equal measures of that with Campari, really rich, bitter, kind of liqueur, effectively. It's actually known as an Amaro, but that sort of information, if you're a consumer at home, isn't overly important. Sweet vermouth, so this is like a spiced fortified wine. And then last up, of course, that tomato ponzu. So let's get on it, let's make a drink, and hopefully my girlfriend will come and join me and we can have a nice evening aperitif together. Right, so let's make this cocktail, a cocktail that I call Umami, because it's absolutely scrummy. There we go, nice bit of cheese for everyone that likes my dad jokes. So what I'm using today, I've tried to choose basically equipment, etc. that most people would have at home, because I'm not sure how many of you have got your bar equipment at home and how many people have left it at the bar. The only thing that is a bit more specialised would be what we call a jigger. So a jigger is effectively a measure. Generally speaking, you have a small side and a larger side. The small side is generally half the size of the larger side. Now, if you don't have one of these, an egg cup, anything else that's a nice small container, these are about 30 millilitres or 1 fluid ounce. But everything in this is equal measures, with the exception of our Lysopin's tomato ponzu, for which I will be using a teaspoon to measure. Nice and easy, okay? Then, rather than a proper bartender's mixing glass, what I've got for you is this, which is literally just a carafe, okay? It's, you know, generally, I think it's actually meant to be a tea steeping carafe, but you could use anything. So generally speaking, I might use this. Oftentimes I'll find myself using the cafetiere. I do, of course, have mixing glasses, but when you're just looking for something quick, it's a really good option, okay? The pouring spout is probably one of the most useful parts of this, so try and find something that has that. Also, something that's clear is quite helpful, because then you can see whether things look right as you're going along and you're not maybe making a mistake. The final thing would be normally a bar spoon with which to stir it, but instead of that, I will be using a chopstick, which works just as well. Excellent, let's get to it. Our first ingredient is, of course, the whiskey. So we've got Tocchi whiskey today. This is one of our most approachable products, most affordable whiskies. I know Japanese whiskey these days is getting pricey, but this one is sticking around 100% Japanese, so it's sticking around 30 to 35 quid a bottle. It's really good value. And we're going to put a full ounce per person of the Tocchi. Now, I'm also making one for my girlfriend, who's over there in the corner looking at me like she wants me to hurry up. But we're going to use, for this cocktail, I'm obviously making 2, but you'd use the small side of your jigger for this bit. In that goes, nice and easy. Excellent. Next up then, we're going to do the same. So same amount, 1 ounce, or one of the smaller measure if you're making 1, or the larger measure if you're making 2, of our sweet vermouth. This one's cocky. Just like your bartender, nice and cocky, always the case. And then lastly, we have Campari, which is that bittersweet Italian Amaro that I mentioned earlier. And again, the same amount. Excellent. Now our final ingredient is, of course, that umami element, the tomato ponzu. And generally speaking, you might use, you know, quite a bit of it. I actually often like to put this into a dasher bottle, but to keep things simple, I'm going to encourage you to just use 1 teaspoon per drink of the umami ingredient, that seasoning that's going to round out our cocktail. Now, it appears that I have not taken the lid off, which is a very smart idea when you're making a very professional looking video. Now I've removed the lid, we should hopefully have a little bit more luck. You'll also notice I don't have a bar in my house. I'm doing this on my knees, which is an excellent way to lose your sense of being able to walk as a bartender. So I'd recommend not doing that as your main bar. We've now got all of those ingredients in there. We're going to add some ice, we're going to stir it up, and we're going to have a lovely cocktail. And I'm sure, hopefully, Sarah will be very happy with me. Before I stir it though, I want to quickly show you what I want to do in terms of a garnish for this cocktail. So let's get a garnish prepped up through this umami cocktail that we're making. So I'm using an orange, which would generally be the traditional garnish that you'd use for a Negroni off of Boulevardier. There's some lovely aromas in the skin of this orange that we're going to spray over or zest over the top of the drink. And all I've done is I've taken a standard potato peeler. You can do it with a knife if you're nice and careful. And I've taken off a nice long strip as well as what I call a coin or a button. So you can see here, I've got my zest ready to go, and I've got my button ready to go. The next thing that I've done is I've just taken off as much of the white from the inside, the pith, the white pith from the inside of the orange. I'm just taking that off because there's lots of horrible bitter flavours that we just don't want those. So we're going to get rid of that bit. Now I've taken this and I've just sheared off a nice straight little line to make a little strip like that. And what we're going to do is we're just going to fold that into a simple knot, because knots are a really nice bit of tradition that you see a lot in Buddhist culture and Shinto culture in Japan. This is a little nice garnish that was taught to me by one of the mentors really of my career, a guy called Mate Shatlos, who was the original head bartender at the Edge Bastion when we opened. And this is a lovely little elegant garnish you can do at home nice and easily. And we're going to keep the coin because this is what we're going to use for creating that zest of aroma over the top of the cocktail. But why not get it stirred up, eh? So icing, you want to get a decent amount in there because it's going to melt quite quickly. You want to try and get it about an inch above the kind of line of where the liquid sits, and just put that in. And if you're going to use proper bar technique, you're going to try and stir using primarily your wrist. So if I bring that closer, you'll see my arm isn't really moving, but my wrist is giving all of the action, which those of you with dirty minds can take however you prefer. Fantastic, well that's all stirred up, that's ready to go. And the last piece of equipment that I failed to mention earlier, because I'm very forgetful, is this, which is a strainer. We call it a hawthorn strainer. So you've got a nice spring in there and little ears to hold it on. It's just a very easy way to leave the ice in whatever you've made your cocktail in and pour it from there to a glass. So let's get this made up. Now I love the texture in a Boulevardier that you get from the Campari. So, fantastic. These are really small glasses, so we've got a bit left over for later, which is fab. But I love to get that texture in there, so I don't like to raise up and pour from a great height because I want to keep that viscosity in there. We're going to get in our aromas from our orange zest, and I'm going to do that from a bit of a distance because actually if you spray it right over and rub it on the rim of the glass, there's really intense bitter oils that we don't want. There's also much lighter oils which will float over it if I just do it from a relative distance. So I'm going to hold it around there, spray that over both drinks. And then last up, of course, our little knots that we made earlier, and they go in. So where's Sarah? Do you want a cocktail?
Yes, please.
That's one for you.
Oh, thank you.
And one for me. Fantastic. Well, to all of you drinking at home, kanpai, and I'll see you soon, hopefully, once this virus nonsense is over. See you later.